Some men become legends for the wars they fight, but Smedley Butler became unforgettable for the conspiracy he said he refused. He was one of America's most decorated military officers, praised for courage, discipline, and unquestioned loyalty to the nation. Yet late in life, he made a claim so explosive that many people still struggle to believe it actually happened. According to Butler, powerful men once tried to recruit him into a plot aimed at undermining American democracy from within. It sounded outrageous, improbable, and almost cinematic, which may be one reason so many people never learned the story properly. But what makes it linger is not just its shock, but the fact that it came from someone difficult to dismiss. Smedley Butler was not an outsider chasing attention or a fringe figure searching for relevance after public life had passed him by. He was a celebrated Marine, a man whose reputation had been built through battlefield prestige and institutional credibility. That is what gives his later warning such unusual weight, because it did not come from the margins. It came from someone who had spent years inside the machinery of American power and knew how that machinery operated. To understand why his accusation mattered, you first have to understand the kind of man Smedley Butler had become. And to understand that man, you have to begin before the scandal, before the speeches, and before the doubt. Smedley Darlington Butler was born in 1881 into a prominent Pennsylvania family with deep political and social connections. His background placed him close to power from the beginning, but his identity would be shaped less by comfort than action. He entered military life young, stepping into a world where discipline, expansion, and national ambition were deeply intertwined. America at the turn of the 20th century was not only growing stronger, it was also growing more aggressive abroad. The language of patriotism often traveled alongside intervention, force, and the belief that power justified itself through mission. Butler became one of the men sent to carry that mission outward, often into places most Americans barely thought about. He served in conflicts and occupations across multiple regions, building a reputation for fearlessness and relentless commitment. His military record became extraordinary, not merely respectable, and his name accumulated the kind of institutional admiration few ever reach. Decorations followed him, promotions followed him, and his public image hardened into that of a soldier beyond question. He was seen as the kind of man whose patriotism had already been proven too thoroughly to ever need defending again. That image would later matter enormously, because when someone like that begins criticizing the system, people are forced to listen differently. Butler had not inherited his authority from rhetoric. He had earned it in the harshest arenas the state could offer. And perhaps that is exactly why what he came to believe later carried such unsettling force. Over time, Butler began to see military service through a less romantic and more morally complicated lens. The glory remained visible on the outside, but he was starting to question what had really been served beneath the slogans. He had witnessed enough to suspect that war was not always driven by the ideals ordinary citizens were told to admire. Instead, he began to see patterns of profit, elite interest, and strategic influence hiding behind the language of duty. That kind of awakening can be especially destabilizing in someone who once embodied the very myths now being questioned. Butler was not becoming anti-courage or anti-service. he was becoming harder to deceive with patriotic packaging. He understood that sacrifice could be real while still being exploited by those who paid none of its cost. That distinction would shape the second half of his public life more than any battlefield ever had. As he grew older, he became increasingly outspoken in ways that made institutions uncomfortable. He was no longer simply a military hero to be displayed, but a respected insider beginning to say dangerous things out loud. Few figures are more unsettling to power than loyal servants who return from the machine, no longer willing to protect its myths. Then came the allegation that would define the strangest and most explosive chapter of his legacy. In the early 1930s, Butler said he was approached by men connected to wealthy interests and political influence. According to his account, they wanted him to help lead a movement that would challenge or override President Franklin Roosevelt's authority. The plan, as Butler described it, involved using his prestige and military credibility to attract support from veterans and others. That detail is crucial because it reveals why someone like Butler would have been useful to such a project. He was not merely famous. He represented legitimacy, force, and the symbolic trust of patriotic America. If he had agreed, his participation could have made something radical appear respectable to people who might otherwise resist it. Butler later testified publicly about what he said he had been told, refusing to quietly absorb the invitation and move on. That decision matters as much as the allegation itself, because silence would have been easier, safer, and more institutionally convenient. Instead, he chose exposure over comfort, knowing full well that many people would call him paranoid, theatrical, or unstable. But the accusation did not disappear simply because it sounded unbelievable. It entered the public record and became part of one of the most controversial episodes in modern American political memory. Some treated it as a serious warning, others as a bizarre exaggeration, and many simply preferred not to look too closely. That last reaction may be the most revealing, because democracies often avoid the stories that expose how fragile they can become. The idea that elite power might seek a more obedient political structure is not comforting, especially when voiced by a decorated insider. And the discomfort deepens when the warning is not theoretical, but attached to names, meetings, and a claimed attempt. Butler insisted he was telling the truth not because it benefited him, but because he believed the public deserved to know. He did not present himself as a savior or a mastermind, but as someone who had recognized a dangerous invitation and refused it. That refusal may be one of the most patriotic acts of his entire life, though it is rarely remembered that way. We often praise service in uniform more easily than service that involves exposing the ambitions of powerful men. Yet one protects a nation's image, while the other may protect its political soul. This is where Smedley Butler's story becomes more than military history and turns into something far more unsettling. It becomes a question about whether American democracy has always been as secure as public myth prefers to imagine. It asks whether the nation's greatest threats have sometimes worn polished shoes instead of enemy uniforms. Butler's warning also fit with his broader criticism of war, power, and the interests that often hide behind national language. He increasingly spoke as someone who had learned that systems can honor sacrifice publicly while exploiting it privately. His words carried unusual force because he was not criticizing from innocence, but from first-hand participation. He knew the institution from the inside, and that made his disillusionment impossible to reduce to ignorance. In later years, he became known not only as a decorated Marine, but as a blunt critic of the structures he once served. That transformation is one reason his legacy remains so difficult to neatly contain inside a patriotic museum frame. He was too accomplished to ignore, but too inconvenient to remember comfortably in full. History often prefers heroes who remain simple, obedient, and emotionally easy to display. Butler was not easy in that way, because his life refused to stay confined to a flattering national script. He had seen too much, believed too much, and eventually said too much for memory to keep him uncomplicated. That may be why his name is often known only partially, if at all, outside certain corners of military or political history. He should be remembered not just as a man who fought wars, but as a man who later questioned what wars often serve. He should also be remembered as someone who claimed America's powerful class once tested how far democracy could be bent. Whether every listener accepts every detail is almost secondary to the larger warning his story leaves behind. Because the core lesson is not only about one alleged plot, but about how vulnerable institutions can become when prestige is weaponized. Butler understood that public trust, once borrowed by the wrong hands, can become one of democracy's greatest weaknesses. That insight feels no less relevant now than it did when he first tried to sound the alarm. Some stories fade because they are minor, but others fade because remembering them would force too many uncomfortable admissions. Smedley Butler belongs to the second category, which is why his story still carries such unusual electricity. He was a war hero who eventually suggested the danger was not only abroad, but inside the ambitions of American power itself. That is not the kind of patriotism history markets easily, but it may be one of the most necessary forms. He reminds us that loyalty to a nation is not always loyalty to the men who claim to represent it. Sometimes the deeper act of loyalty is refusal, especially when power begins asking for obedience in the name of protection. Butler's legacy lives in that refusal and in the uneasy question he leaves behind for every generation after him. How often do societies celebrate the uniforms that defend them while ignoring the voices that warn them from within? And how often does truth become easier to dismiss precisely because it arrives from a place too unsettling to absorb? Smedley Butler did not vanish because he lacked importance, but because his story made patriotism far less comfortable than people preferred. He exposed a version of American power that was harder to frame, harder to market, and harder to safely teach. That is exactly why he still matters, and why his warning continues to echo long after his own voice went quiet. And if his story stayed with you, the next may be just as haunting. Bessie Coleman, the woman who flew higher than the country that tried to keep her grounded.